And across the road, where you can see there's that blue roller-down shutter. That used to be the entrance to the building. Now, I told you about the murder of Catherine Eddowes, and I told you that took place at 1:40 in the morning. 20 minutes to 2. At about 20 minutes to, well, let's say about 10 minutes to 3. You had a police officer who came by here, who went past the entrance, and he saw two things. On the ground, he saw a piece of cloth covered with blood. That's number one. Number two, he saw chalked up on the wall the sentence, "The Jews are not the men who will be blamed for nothing." Jews was spelled J-U-W-E-S. You just talk about the cloth first of all. The cloth was covered in blood, and it turned out to be Catherine Eddowes' petticoat. So clearly what had happened was that, having committed the murder, Jack the Ripper had torn off a piece of cloth from Catherine Eddowes' body. He used it to wipe his hand, wipe his knife on his way home. He probably came down the very streets that we just walked down, and he'd be heading in this direction. Now, there are some people who argue that he actually had lived in this building. However, chances are that actually he probably lived just a little way beyond. What has happened in recent days is that they've been able to get data on the places where murders take place, that serial murderers murder their victims, and then in relation to where they live, and they've been able to then project all this information onto a map of Whitechapel of 1888. And they reckon that the greatest likelihood was that Jack the Ripper must have lived in a street called Flower and Dean Street, which, as I say, is just a little way beyond here. So it makes sense, as I say, that what happened was that Jack the Ripper had murdered Catherine Eddowes, ripped off a piece of her clothing, used it to clean his hands, clean his knife, chucked it aside. He didn't have to bother about fingerprints or DNA or anything, he didn't know anything about that stuff. And then he'd make his way around the corner and just a little way beyond was Flower and Dean Street, and that makes sense. The other thing is this rather curious, what we call the writing on the wall, the Goulston Street graffiti. There have been no end of problems, and an entire book written about this, which is just fiction. The man in question is a man called Stephen Knight. He had an axe to grind against a group of people called the Freemasons. He came up with the idea that the murders were committed by this secret organisation at the behest of royalty, in order to suppress this information about the royal marriage. He claimed that Jews, J-U-W-E-S, was code name for Jubilo, Jubilar, and Jubilant. Well, having told you about that, ladies and gentlemen, you can just dismiss it again, because there are no such things in Masonic ritual. If you want to know anything about the Masons, you can go and get books on Amazon. You can go into a public library and get books on Masonic ritual, and you can even go into the Masonic Museum in the Covent Garden, not nearly as secret as they claim to be. Quite simply, the word Jews is Jews. It's J-U-W-E-S. It's as simple as that. We know for a fact then that historically we had large numbers of Jewish people fleeing Russia during the 1880s from the pogroms in Russia. They settled in the large cities in Western Europe. When they came to London, they settled in this district. This was a very heavily populated Jewish area. There was a lot of feeling against Jewish people at that time, and there was a certain amount of substance to it. There was one of the gang leaders in this area, a man called John Pizer, sometimes known as the Leather Apron, used to make money by threatening prostitutes with a knife and getting money out of them that way. Now what happened was that he was the chief suspect of the police. He was taken in by the police and questioned, and fortunately for him, he had actually been taken in by the police on one of the nights of the murder, so he had a perfect alibi, but he was very, very hot water at one time. The question always remains now, and it's an argument, and I won't go into it's an argument, the question, was it written by Jack the Ripper, or was it just somebody who wrote there something earlier in the day, a piece of graffiti, with no relation to the case? And you can argue it one way or the other, and you can't come to a conclusion. There's a school of thought which says that if you've just committed a murder, the last thing you want to do is draw attention to yourself or waste time by writing curious words on walls. There's another school of thought that says that the Zodiac killer in California in the 1960s used to taunt the police by sending them rather curious messages in code, and therefore it just possibly was the work of Jack the Ripper. What was unfortunate was that the chief of police, a man called Sir Charles Warren, when he came down here at 4 o'clock in the morning, he saw this graffiti. He gave instructions that it should be wiped out. The last thing he wanted was to have a riot on his hands, because he thought it would provoke a riot against the Jewish people living in this area. Now, doing that was very controversial because he was potentially destroying evidence, which is a criminal offence. For that, he lost his job about 2 weeks later. But again, it's a big argument as to whether it actually had any connection with the Ripper murders or not. What I want to do is take you further down the street, and I want to talk again about the Ripper. Yes, please ask the question, please.
The spelling of Jewish.
Yes.
Does that imply he's educated or uneducated?
It implies that he's uneducated.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't know how to spell properly.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think it was, but we know it isn't true. That's just a piece of nonsense. So Jews misspelled.
The Ripper murder, a lot of it implies that he had knowledge of the workers, right?
Well, that's disputed.
Disputed?
Yes, it's not. It was thought that Jack the Ripper may have been a surgeon, he may have been a doctor, he may have known exactly how to cut the body open. The question is, he worked in such a short space of time. But then again, when you look at the injuries on the body, you can see that there's been gashes already quite jagged, so you don't really think that it was a person with professional man doing the job. There was something that said we never know who Jack the Ripper was. The only thing we know about him is the surgeon who was left-handed. There's no clue that he was actually a surgeon. There's no evidence, no agreement that he was left-handed. I'm sorry, that's just one of these sort of things about Jack the Ripper. If I can put that out of your head, it's probably better than I do. What I'd like to do is take you down the street again, and I want to show you part of this area, which has all been changed. And I also want to talk about another piece of important evidence. So, time to here, please. I need you all to huddle together. And across the road there's one block, not straggling. Nothing coming in any direction at the moment. So let's cross now. Right, so as I say, the murders took place in 1888. The following year, 1889, they created a body called the London County Council. The London County Council took it upon themselves to take responsibility for the slum development, and they just came in with a wrecking ball and they just basically flattened the whole area. And then they started rebuilding. They started building the wider streets. They put in drains and sewers and street lighting, which of course very much needed. The houses that were built at that time have come to their end of their natural life. And there's a whole new generation of buildings going up. So come back here in about 10 or 20 years and the whole place will have changed. However, ladies and gentlemen, you may be glad to hear that not everything was flattened. There's just a little area just around the corner. I'm going to show you a few streets which have the same appearance that they had in Jack the Ripper's time. So you can easily imagine what the rest of this part of London used to look like. Before I do that, what I want to do is just discuss some of the letters that were sent to the police and to the press. The police themselves were under tremendous pressure, as you can imagine, to catch the murderer. They'd never experienced anything like this before, so they didn't know quite what to do. They started to recruit a number of ordinary citizens to form vigilance committees to patrol the streets on behalf of the police and to make a report. Now then, there were a number of letters that were sent to various people. There were about 800 that came out every week. I won't go all of them, but many of them were hoax letters. Well, that's pretty well all of them were hoax letters, or letters telling the police how they should do their jobs. But there are two letters which are especially interesting, and what I have is a copy of about 20. Now, I think I've probably got about over 40 people, so I'm have to ask you to share these out. Can you just have a look at this? It's this one that I want to talk about first of all. Sorry. There you go. Thank you. Anybody else without one? Yes. All right. Anybody else not got access to a letter? What I want to talk about is this one here, this first one you see, which is called the Dear Boss letter. This was sent to the Central News Agency. You can see it's dated the 25th of September. And it was written out in red ink. And it was sent to the Central News Agency, and it says, Dear Boss, I keep hearing the police have called me that they won't fix me just yet. Blah, 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 blah. Then right at the end it says, my knife is so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now, that's the first occasion when the name Jack the Ripper stuck. Before that, they were talking about the leather apron, or they were talking about the Whitechapel theme. When they received that, they got the name Jack the Ripper, and that's the name that has stuck ever since. And it's even used for serial murders. We don't even do ripping. We had the Yorkshire Ripper about 30 or 40 years ago. Of course, Peter Sutton, who actually didn't rip his body there, he was not very simple. Hammer, charming man, our way forward. But anyway, the letter itself was a source of controversy. It's been debated for several years as to whether it was a real thing or whether it was a hoax letter. And only recently they've actually discovered the letter was a hoax. It was written by a man called Thomas Bulling. It was entirely made up by a journalist in order to the purpose of just generating a bit of page views in the storyline. So there's no substance to this except the name, which the name is stuck. As I said, it's not only stuck to the murder we're talking about, but several murders in the same description. Now this letter here, which we call the From Hell letter, was sent to George Lusk, who was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. No date on it. He received it on the 16th of October. When he got it, it came with a small packet. When he opened the packet up, he found inside half a kidney. He thought it was a hoax. Nevertheless, he took it to the local hospital to examine, and they confirmed that it was a kidney. It was a human kidney. They couldn't tell whether it came from a male or a female. They knew it came from an adult, and they knew it came from the left-hand side of the body. They also knew that the kidney was from somebody who suffered from Bright's disease. And what is interesting is that Catherine Eddowes was suffering from Bright's disease. So if you connect the kidney with Catherine Eddowes, and then connect the kidney with this letter, the argument goes that this is the handwriting of the Whitechapel murderer. Okay, I won't say it's 100% watertight. There are arguments against it. I won't go into that, it's too much time. But what it says is, from hell, Mr. Lusk, Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you, t'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if only you wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, the Lusk. Now the argument is that whoever it was who wrote this had an education, but not a complete education. As you can see, they've made a number of interesting spelling mistakes, as indeed there was a spelling mistake on the writing up in Dawson Street. It's a shame that we don't have the writing in Dawson Street, because if anything looked like this, then it would tell us a lot, wouldn't it? But what it says, I say, it shows us somebody here who has had the basic education. They've not had an advanced education. So we're talking about somebody from the working classes, somebody who lives in this area. And again, if you look at the letter very carefully, you can apply the study of graphology, which is the study of the psychology, the application of psychology to handwriting, in the way that letters are written and spread out. You've got these very, very heavy downstrokes, the Y, putting a lot of pressure on those, as if somebody is stabbing into the paper, right? A lot of pent-up energy. So this is why they think this is the argument for it being authentic. And if we could find another piece of lighting like this with a name on it, then we'd have a positive. This is how the argument goes. If you want to follow the argument, then you have to go, it goes on and on and on. You have to go to a website called casebook.org. And believe me, there's enough material there to keep you occupied for several weeks, I would think. But I'm just trying to boil this all down for you. This letter is believed to be the most genuine example of all the letters that were received. And there are many people, including myself, by the way, who think it is authentic. Can I have them back, please? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, thank you, thank you. As I say, casebook.org is the website if you want to go to follow this matter up. We would be here all evening, and as I say, we already started. What I will now do, ladies and gentlemen, is I will take you to the only little surviving corner of Spitalfields, which looks now, in this period in the day, exactly. So follow me. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, as I said before, this street, Sandys Row, was laid out in the 17th century. The buildings on either side date from the mid-Victorian period, and the only major difference between the appearance now and as it was then is this overkill of electric light. Obviously there was no electric light here in 1888. The best you could hope for would have been gas lamps. But otherwise, it gives you a clear impression of what all the streets in this district used to look like in Jack the Ripper's time. What I want to do is take you down here, and then lead you off to the right-hand side up one of the side alleyways to talk about the murder.
He's everywhere though. Yeah.
You could send that so for the idea of actually
Never come up.
how much
I literally have to go to them tonight.
Why are you rolling? Why are you rolling? Sorry, I think just striding ahead in order to get to the place. Those don't move quite right. So then, ladies and gentlemen, across the way we have a new building which has completely obliterated Miller's Court and Dorset Street. It's called the Fruit, or it will be known as the Fruit and Wool Exchange when it opens next year. Dorset Street, you can see where those big black doors are on the dip in the pavement. Dorset Street used to run directly across into Commercial Street, then Miller's Court was just a little alleyway off the side. That was the home of Mary Kelly. The murder of Mary Kelly is rather different from the other murders. She was only 25, whereas the other victims were in their 40s. And this murder took place indoors, whereas the other murders took place in the open air. Mary Kelly had been born in Ireland. She travelled as a girl with her family to Wales. She'd married a coal miner who was killed in a mining accident when she was 16. She went off to Cardiff. She started drifting into prostitution in Cardiff. Then she got the ambitions to come down to London, and she worked in a house of ill repute in the West End. And from there she was sent off to work in Paris. That's where she acquired her name, Marie-Jeanette Kelly. She didn't like Paris very much. She managed to escape and return to London, but she didn't go to the West End. She came here. She started. She got into a relationship with a man called Joe Barnett. Joe Barnett was a fish porter in Billingsgate Fish Market, and they went steady. They may have even been thinking about getting married. And they lived together in this single room in Miller's Court, 10 foot by 10 foot, with a single bed and 2 chairs and a table and a fireplace. That was it, really. So that was quite cosy, except that Joe Barnett lost his job at the beginning of September, so that created a crisis, obviously. They found it increasingly difficult to pay the rent. The rent started going into arrears, and Mary Kelly's solution to the problem was to go out into the street, and Joe Barnett didn't like that idea at all, so there was a huge argument which resulted in a broken window, and Joe Barnett then moved out and left Mary Kelly to her own devices. What she did, as I say, arrears of rent were mounting up, so she had to try and settle as best with her landlord, and she simply had to go out to the street and earn the money. Now, on the 9th of November, people giving evidence at the inquest said that particular early morning they could hear people going back and forth in the courtyard below. Somebody who said they were woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning by somebody calling out murder. But they thought it was such a normal thing to hear in this district that they rolled over and went back to sleep. So it wasn't until the landlord's man went along at 10:45 the following morning, knocked on the door, no answer, went round the side, saw the window had been covered up with a coat, pushed the coat aside, and that's when he saw the body. Went straight back to tell his boss. His boss went to tell the police, and eventually the police managed to break in, and what they found was that Jack the Ripper had about an hour to do the job that he set out to do, and not only had he done his usual thing of cutting the throat and then strangulation, cutting the throat and cutting the body open, but he carved large chunks of flesh off the body and sort of scattered them around the room. And Mary Kelly could only be identified by her eyes and her ears. So it was a pretty grim business, and that's really the point, ladies and gentlemen, where the story comes to a standstill rather than to a logical conclusion. The question then is, well, who did it? And when I started doing these tours about 5 years ago, I was of the opinion that the most likely suspect would have been a man called Aaron Kosminski. Now, Kosminski at that time, he was about 23 years old. He was a Polish-Jewish barber. He was known to have psychiatric problems. He'd be wandering around the streets of Whitechapel. He'd become very aggressive if he was approached. After the murder of Mary Kelly, the police kept him under 24-hour surveillance, and eventually, although they couldn't find enough evidence to convict him of the murders, they had enough evidence to put him into a psychiatric home, and he was eventually confined to a psychiatric home until he died in 1919. As I say, after him, the murders stopped. So, what do you think? Well, that's not enough evidence to convict him or send anyone to the gallows. And I'm not now entirely convinced, only because I don't think that even though he was semi-literate, he would have written this. This is something written by a British person. I get that sense. I don't know. I don't think it's written by a professional man, but I think it's. I don't think it's written by a foreigner either. Anyway, going on from there, there was a man called James Kelly. James Kelly was an upholsterer, which meant that he had to walk around carrying sharp knives to cut up a piece of old furniture. He lived in this district, and he used to work in this district, and we know that in 1883 he murdered his wife by cutting her throat. He was sent to the Old Bailey for trial. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. Nevertheless, the sentence was commuted, to life imprisonment in Broadmoor, a home for the criminally insane. So he went to Broadmoor. He escaped from Broadmoor in January of 1888. He was one of the few people to escape. And where he went, we don't know, but we assume he came back here. It seems to be common sense. The next thing we know for certain is that he turns up on the doorstep of Broadmoor in 1929. By that time he's an old man. He has nowhere else to go. And they say to him, okay, come in, but what have you been doing with all this time? He said, well, in November of 1888, I left England. I went first of all to France, then I went to America. And he spent most of his time in America. What's interesting about that is that there was a murder of a prostitute in a Manhattan hotel in 1891, which might be the work of Kelly, but then again it might not. As I say, the type of murderer, the type of person who engages in these murders, is working under compulsion. And if he'd gone to France, if he'd gone to America, where they had a developed police force, the murders would have started again. They'd have had to start again. There'd have to be more than one. So again, I'm not convinced that it is James Kelly. And what I'm looking at now is a man called William Berry. William Berry used to sell sawdust from a cart. And shortly after the last murder, he left the district. He went to Scotland, lived in Dundee, and very shortly afterwards he murdered his wife by cutting her throat. And for this he was hanged in May of 1889. He never confessed to being the murderer. So I just don't know, ladies and gentlemen. I'm being perfectly honest with you. I don't know the answer to this. You've come out and you've listened very patiently to me on this tour. Come back next week and I'll come up possibly with another suspect. But all I can say is, for my money, it has to be a male. It has to be the murderer has to be somewhere between probably 25 and 35, living locally, and a person from the working class with a sort of rudimentary education. Somebody who could possibly have written this letter. Not a professional person, I hasten to add. So, as I say, come back next week and I may have another suspect in mind, but it will be somebody on that in that sort of direction. Now, no doubt other people are going to come up with other names. As I say, if they don't meet those criteria, I would just put them out of your head. But if they do meet those criteria, then we can start talking seriously. What I'm going to do now is take you across the road to pick up the coach. And since we've got the coast clear, let's cross now. I'll take you around the corner. I will take you across the lights in just a moment. Over on the right-hand side, you've got a church called Christ Church, Spitalfields, and I showed you the towers on Westminster Abbey, the work of the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor. This is the work of the same architect using the Baroque style, which is more well associated with churches like St Anne's Limehouse and St George in the east. And then over on the left-hand side, you've got our coach. Behind the coach, you have a pub called the 10 Bells. There used to be 10 bells in the steeple when it was consecrated in 1729. The pub is the pub that was used by we know at least two of the Ripper victims, to be Mary Kelly and Anne Chapman. Anne Chapman was murdered in Canterbury Street, which is further down on the right-hand side, and I will tell you that in the coach. But you can go into this area, walk around this district, at your own leisure sometime during the day, and perhaps take a drink in the 10 Bells. It's supposed to be haunted. There's a poltergeist apparently which switches the radio on and off. But apart from that, it's very much associated with the Jack the Ripper story. Let's get over the road and get back on that coast.